The darkness of space stretched endlessly around the massive human warship as Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UHS Vengeance. The year was 2387, and humanity had built the most powerful war fleet the galaxy had ever seen. 12 giant ships floated in perfect formation around the flagship, each one armed with weapons that could destroy entire planets. The humans who served on these ships had earned a fearsome name across the stars. Other alien races called them Deathworlders because they came from Earth, a planet so dangerous that most species would die within hours of landing there. Jake had gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too many battles. He wore the dark blue uniform of the human space navy with pride. On his chest were medals from dozens of wars fought against alien invaders who thought humans would be easy prey. They had all learned the same hard lesson that humans never gave: up and never back down from a fight. The bridge of the Vengeance was a marvel of human engineering. Screens showed star maps and weapon systems, while crew members worked at their stations with quiet efficiency. The ship itself was over 2 miles long and carried enough firepower to level a small moon. Its hull was made from materials that could withstand the heat of a sun, and its engines could push it faster than light itself. Commander Lisa Rodriguez sat at the communication station, checking for any messages from Earth or the outer colonies. She was a small woman with dark hair and quick hands that danced across her control panel. Lisa had been with the fleet for 8 years and could speak 17 different alien languages. Her job was to listen to the vast emptiness of space for any signals that might be important. Captain Ryan Murphy worked nearby at the language analysis station. He was tall and thin, with blonde hair and glasses that made him look more like a teacher than a soldier. Ryan could decode almost any alien message and had helped the fleet communicate with dozens of different species over the years. His computer screens showed wave patterns and translation algorithms that most people could not understand. Dr. Amanda Foster stood behind them, both studying readings from the long-range sensors. She was middle-aged with red hair and green eyes that missed nothing. Amanda could tell where a signal came from and how far it had traveled through space. Her equipment could detect radio waves from thousands of light years away. The three of them worked together like parts of a well-oiled machine. When Lisa found a signal, Ryan would decode it, and Amanda would trace its source. Most of the time, they only picked up normal space traffic or messages between trading ships. But today, something different appeared on Lisa's screen. "Admiral Morrison, sir?" Lisa called out in a voice that made everyone on the bridge turn to look at her. "I'm getting something strange on the emergency frequency. It's very weak, but it's definitely an SOS signal." Jake walked over to her station and looked at the readout. The signal was barely visible among the background noise of space, but it was there. Someone somewhere was calling for help. "Where is it coming from, Commander Rodriguez?" Jake asked. Amanda's fingers flew over her controls as she traced the signal back to its source. Star charts appeared on the main screen showing a path through space that led to a distant solar system. "The Kepler 442 system, sir," Amanda reported. "That's about 3 weeks away at maximum hyperspace speed. The signal is very old, though. It was sent almost 6 months ago." Ryan was already working to decode the message. His computer showed alien symbols and sound patterns that slowly began to make sense. The universal SOS frequency was something all spacefaring races used when they needed help, but the rest of the message was in a language he had never seen before. "It's definitely a distress call," Ryan said as he worked. "The language is new to me, but I'm starting to get pieces of it. They're asking for help against something called the Virex." Jake's face grew dark at that name. The Virex Dominion was one of the most feared forces in the galaxy. They were insect-like creatures that traveled in huge swarms, consuming everything in their path. Entire civilizations had vanished when the Vrex decided their worlds would make good breeding grounds. "Keep working on that translation, Captain Murphy," Jake ordered. "I want to know everything they're saying." The next hour passed slowly as Ryan fought to understand the alien message. Lisa boosted the signal strength while Amanda gathered more information about the Kepler 4I-42 system. The bridge crew worked quietly, but Jake could feel the tension in the air. Everyone knew that an SOS signal usually meant someone was about to die. Finally, Ryan straightened up from his station with a grim expression on his face. He had translated enough of the message to understand what was happening. "Admiral, the signal is from something called the Altarian Republic," Ryan reported. "They're a peaceful race that's being attacked by the Vrex Dominion. The Vrex have already destroyed most of their defense fleet and are preparing to invade their home worlds." Jake nodded grimly. This was exactly what he had feared to hear. "What else, Captain?" Jake asked. "They say they've heard stories about the terror species from Earth," Ryan continued. "They're begging for help and offering their entire planetary treasury as payment. Sir, they sound desperate. The message says their entire civilization will be extinct within months if no one comes to help them." The bridge fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. The Altarians were 3 weeks away and probably already dead by now. The Vrex had been known to wipe out entire planets in a matter of days once they decided to attack. But Jake had not built humanity's war fleet to ignore cries for help. "How many ships do intelligence reports say the Vrex have in that system?" Jake asked his tactical officer. Lieutenant Nathan Phillips checked his files, and his face went pale. "Last reports indicated over 3,000 Vrex bioships, sir. That includes at least 50 of their heavy hive ships that can destroy planets." The numbers were staggering. The human fleet had 12 ships against 3,000. Most military commanders would call it suicide to even consider such a mission. But Jake Morrison had not become admiral by backing down from impossible odds. "Commander Rodriguez, send a message to all ships in the fleet," Jake ordered. "All senior officers are to report to the Vengeance for an emergency meeting in 1 hour. We're going to discuss our options." Lisa nodded and began sending the messages. Within minutes, shuttles were launching from the other 11 ships as captains and commanders prepared to come aboard the flagship. Jake walked to the large window that looked out into space. The other ships of his fleet hung in the darkness like sleeping giants. Each one was crewed by humans who had volunteered to fight against the most dangerous enemies the galaxy could produce. They had faced impossible odds before and somehow always found a way to win. "Sir," Amanda said quietly from her station, "I'm detecting some interesting readings from the Kepler 442 system. There are massive energy signatures that suggest the Vrex are still there and still active. That meant the Altarians might still be alive. If the Vrex had already finished with them, the energy readings would be much lower. There was still a chance that someone could be saved if the human fleet acted quickly." Jake made his decision. He had sworn an oath to protect innocent life wherever he found it. The fact that the Altarians were aliens did not matter. The fact that his fleet was outnumbered did not matter. What mattered was that somewhere in the darkness people were dying and calling for help. "Set course for the Kepler 442 system," Jake ordered. "Maximum hyperspace velocity. We're going to war." The war room aboard the UHS Vengeance had been designed for moments like this. A large circular table dominated the center of the room with holographic displays that could show star maps, battle plans, and ship formations. Admiral Jake Morrison sat at the head of the table as his most trusted officers filed in through the heavy blast doors. These were the men and women who would help him decide whether humanity would answer the desperate call for help from the Altarian Republic. Colonel Danny Hayes was the first to take his seat. He commanded the Space Marines aboard the fleet, and his job was to fight battles on the ground when ships could not do the work. Danny was a big man with scarred hands and cold blue eyes that had seen too much combat. His black uniform was covered, with patches from every major battle the Marines had fought in the last 10 years. When other species needed to be convinced that humans were dangerous, they usually looked at men like Danny Hayes. Captain Kelly Wright entered next and sat across from the colonel. She commanded the carrier ship UHS Fury, which held hundreds of fighter craft and their pilots. Kelly was shorter than most of the men in the room, but everyone knew she was one of the best tactical minds in the fleet. Her brown hair was pulled back in a tight military style, and her green eyes studied the holographic displays that were already showing information about the Kepler 442 system. Commander Steve Johnson slipped into the room so quietly that most people did not notice him arrive. He was in charge of the Stealth Corvette Division, and his ship specialized in missions that required invisibility and surprise attacks. Steve was average height with gray hair and a face that people forgot as soon as they looked away. This was exactly the kind of appearance that made him perfect for covert operations. General Patricia Collins was the last senior officer to arrive. She commanded all ground operations for the fleet, and her job was to coordinate between the Marines and the regular Army units when planets needed to be invaded or defended. Patricia was a tall woman with silver hair and a stern expression that made junior officers nervous. She had been fighting alien enemies longer than anyone else in the room except Admiral Morrison himself. Lieutenant Nathan Phillips entered behind the general carrying data tablets and classified intelligence reports. As the fleet intelligence officer, Nathan knew more about alien military capabilities than almost any human alive. He was young and nervous-looking, but his information had saved the fleet from ambushes and surprise attacks dozens of times. Dr. Margaret Lewis came in last, carrying a briefcase full of technical specifications and weapons data. She was the chief scientist for the entire fleet, and her job was to make sure human technology stayed ahead of anything their enemies could build. Margaret was middle-aged with wild gray hair and thick glasses that made her look like she spent all her time staring at computer screens. In fact, that was exactly what she did, and her work had given humanity weapons that other species could barely imagine. Admiral Morrison waited until everyone was seated before activating the holographic display in the center of the table. A three-dimensional map of the Kepler 442 system appeared, showing 3 planets orbiting a yellow sun. Red markers indicated the last known positions of Rex ships, while blue markers showed what remained of the Altarian defense forces. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation. Jake began in a calm voice that did not reveal how desperate things really were. 6 months ago, the Altarian Republic sent out a distress call asking for help against a Vrex invasion. We received that signal today, and it appears the Altarians are still fighting for their lives. Nathan Phillips stood up and activated his data tablet. New information appeared on the holographic display showing the estimated size and composition of the Vrex fleet. Intelligence reports indicate the Vrex have deployed over 3,000 ships to the Altarian system, Nathan said in a voice that tried to stay professional despite the terrible numbers he was reporting. This includes their standard bioships that fight in swarm formations, plus at least 50 heavy hive ships capable of planetary bombardment. Each hive ship carries thousands of Vrex warriors and enough biological weapons to sterilize an entire world. Colonel Hayes leaned forward to study the tactical display. His experience told him that fighting 3,000 enemy ships with only 12 human vessels was not just difficult, but probably impossible. But Danny had learned never to give up before a battle even started. What do we know about Vrex battle? Tactics, Danny asked. Nathan switched the display to show recordings from previous encounters with the Vrex Dominion. The images were not pleasant to watch. Vrex ships moved in huge swarms that overwhelmed enemy defenses through sheer numbers. They did not care about losses and would sacrifice hundreds of their own ships to destroy a single enemy vessel. The Vrex fight like insects, Nathan explained. They have no fear of death and will attack in waves until either they win or their entire force is destroyed. They use biological weapons that can eat through most types of armor, and their ships are grown rather than built so they can repair battle damage by feeding on organic matter. Captain Wright studied the enemy ship formations with the eye of someone who had spent years fighting in space battles. Her fighters were fast and deadly, but there were limits to what even the best pilots could accomplish against such overwhelming numbers. What about the Altarian forces? Kelly asked. Are any of their ships still operational? The display changed to show blue markers scattered throughout the system. Most of them were very faint, indicating damaged or destroyed vessels. The Altarian defense fleet has been almost completely eliminated, Nathan reported. We estimate they have fewer than 50 ships remaining, and most of those are badly damaged. Their technology is approximately 200 years behind current human standards, so they were never really able to fight the Vrex effectively. General Collins frowned as she looked at the planetary defenses. Her job would be to coordinate any ground operations if the fleet decided to intervene in the battle. What about civilian populations? Patricia asked. How many Altarians are we talking about saving? Nathan checked his files and the numbers were sobering. The 3 Altarian worlds have a combined population of approximately 8 billion people. Most of them are concentrated in large cities that would be easy targets for Vrex bombardment. Dr. Lewis had been quietly studying technical specifications, while the others talked about tactics and numbers. Now she cleared her throat and activated her own data display. I have some information that might change our tactical options, Margaret said as new weapon specifications appeared on the holographic table. We have been developing quantum disruption torpedoes specifically designed to fight biological ships, like the ones the Vrex use. Everyone leaned forward to examine the new weapons data. The torpedoes used quantum field manipulation to tear apart organic matter at the molecular level. Against traditional metal and ceramic ship hulls, they would be only moderately effective, but against living Vrex bioships they could be devastating. How many of these torpedoes do we have? Admiral Morrison asked. Each ship in the fleet carries 20 quantum disruption torpedoes, Margaret replied. That gives us a total of 240 weapons. Computer simulations suggest that each torpedo has a 70% chance of completely destroying a Vrex bioship regardless of size. The mood in the room began to change as the officers realized they might actually have a chance of winning this impossible battle. 240 shots that could each kill an enemy ship suddenly made 3,000 Vrex vessels seem less intimidating. Commander Johnson had been studying the star charts while the others discussed weapons. His stealth ships would play a crucial role in any battle plan they developed. If we can get close enough to use those torpedoes without being detected, we might be able to even the odds, Steve said quietly. My corvettes can slip past their outer defenses and hit their command ships before they know we're there. Colonel, Hayes nodded approvingly. A surprise attack that eliminated enemy commanders could throw the entire Vrex swarm into confusion. "What about evacuation possibilities?" Danny asked. "Can we get any Altarian civilians out before the shooting starts?" Captain Wright was already working on fighter deployment scenarios. Her pilots were the best in human space and could provide cover for evacuation operations. "If we coordinate properly, we might be able to evacuate several million people," Kelly said. "My fighters can provide escort while the corvettes transport civilians to safe locations." Admiral Morrison listened to all the suggestions and proposals while studying the tactical situation. The plan that was emerging was dangerous and would require perfect timing, but it might actually work. More importantly, it was the right thing to do regardless of the risks involved. "Here is what we are going to do," Jake announced after considering all the options. "Commander Johnson will take his stealth corvettes ahead of the main fleet and begin evacuating Altarian civilians. Captain Wright will provide fighter cover for the evacuation while gathering intelligence on Vrex positions. Colonel Hayes will prepare his Marines for ground operations in case we need to rescue people who cannot be evacuated by ship." He paused to look each officer in the eye before continuing. 3 weeks of hyperspace travel brought the human fleet to the edge of the Kepler 442 system, and what they found there was worse than anyone had imagined. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UHS Vengeance, staring at the main display screen with growing anger. The beautiful blue and green worlds of the Altarian Republic were surrounded by thousands of dark shapes that moved like a plague of locusts through space. The Vrex bioships were unlike anything humanity had ever built. They looked like giant insects with chitinous hulls that pulsed with sickly bioluminescent lights. Some were as small as human fighters, while others were massive hive ships, larger than Earth's biggest cities. They moved in chaotic swarms that defied normal military formations, yet somehow maintained perfect coordination through biological communication networks. Commander Lisa Rodriguez worked frantically at her communications station, trying to establish contact with any surviving Altarian forces. The electromagnetic spectrum was filled with Vrex biological signals that made normal radio communication almost impossible. But Lisa had not become the fleet's chief communications officer by giving up when things got difficult. "Admiral, I'm getting something," Lisa called out as she filtered through the alien chatter. "It's weak and intermittent, but someone is definitely trying to reach us on standard emergency frequencies." Captain Ryan Murphy hurried to help decode the incoming transmission. The message was in the same Altarian language he had been studying for 3 weeks, but now he could understand most of what was being said. "They're calling themselves the Altarian Resistance," Ryan reported as he worked to clean up the signal. "The speaker identifies himself as Zeph Prime and says he commands what's left of their military forces." Admiral Morrison nodded grimly. At least someone was still alive down there and still fighting back against the Vrex invasion. "Put him through Commander Rodriguez," Jake ordered. The main screen flickered and suddenly showed the face of an alien unlike any human had ever seen before. Zeph Prime was tall and slender with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer like crystal. His large eyes were completely black and filled with an intelligence that was both alien and strangely familiar. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of months of desperate fighting. "Human vessels, we greet you with gratitude beyond measure," Zeph Prime said in accented but understandable English. "We had given up hope that anyone would answer our call for help. I am Zeph Prime, military commander of what remains of the Altarian Republic." Jake stepped forward so the alien could see him clearly. "This is Admiral Jake Morrison of the Human Space Navy. We received your distress signal and came as quickly as we could. What is your current situation? The Altarian leader's crystalline skin shifted to a darker blue color that Ryan recognized as an expression of deep sadness. The situation is desperate, Admiral Morrison, Zeph Prime replied. The Vrex have been attacking our worlds for 6 months. They have destroyed most of our cities and enslaved millions of our people. Our defense fleet was eliminated in the first week of fighting. We have perhaps 2 weeks before our remaining population centers fall to their ground forces. Dr. Amanda Foster studied her sensor readings and confirmed what Zeph Prime was telling them. The 3 Altarian worlds showed massive areas where cities had once stood, but now only crater-marked wastelands remained. The Vrex had been systematically destroying everything that supported Altarian civilization. How many civilians are still alive? Admiral Morrison asked. We estimate 6 billion people remain on our 3 worlds, Zeph Prime answered. Most are hiding in underground shelters or remote mountain areas. But the Vrex are hunting them with biological tracking creatures. Every day, thousands more are captured and taken to the breeding colonies. Colonel Danny Hayes felt his jaw clench at the mention of breeding colonies. Intelligence reports on Vrex tactics indicated they used captured prisoners as living incubators for their larvae. It was one of the most horrific fates any sentient being could suffer. Zeph Prime. We need detailed information about Vrex positions and capabilities, Jake said. We're going to get your people out of there, but we need to know exactly what we're fighting. The Altarian transmitted tactical data that appeared on the human displays. The numbers were even worse than Nathan Phillips had estimated. Over 4,000 Vrex ships now filled the system, with more arriving every day. The main hive ships had taken positions around each of the 3 planets and were systematically bombarding population centers. Commander Steve Johnson studied the enemy positions with the calculating eye of someone who specialized in impossible missions. His stealth corvettes would need to slip past thousands of enemy sensors to reach the civilian population centers. Admiral, I can get my ships through their patrol lines, Steve said quietly. The Vrex rely on biological sensors that have trouble detecting our stealth technology, but we'll need fighter cover once we start the evacuation. Captain Kelly Wright was already planning fighter deployment from her carrier ship, UHS Fury. Her pilots had trained for years to operate in hostile environments, but this would test their skills to the limit. How many evacuation ships do we have available? Kelly asked. General Patricia Collins checked the fleet manifests. Each human ship carried emergency evacuation pods, but the numbers were sobering when compared to 6 billion people who needed to be rescued. If we strip every ship in the fleet, we can evacuate approximately 2 million people per trip, Patricia reported. That means we'll need multiple runs to save everyone. Admiral Morrison made a quick calculation. Even if everything went perfectly, they would need dozens of evacuation runs to save the entire Altarian population. The Vrex would not sit idle while human ships carried away their intended victims. Zeph Prime. Where are your people concentrated? Jake asked. We need to prioritize evacuation sites based on defensibility and access. The Altarian commander transmitted location data for the major refugee camps. Most were hidden in mountain valleys or underground cave systems that provided some protection from Vrex aerial attacks. The largest concentration is on Altair Prime, in the northern mountains, Zeph Prime explained. Nearly 1 billion people are hiding in a cave system that extends for hundreds of kilometers underground. But the Vrex have begun sending ground forces to hunt them. Colonel Hayes studied the terrain maps and nodded approvingly. Mountain caves would be defensible positions if his Marines could get there in time, My people can hold mountain positions against Vrek's ground forces, Danny said. But we'll need to move fast before they bring up heavy weapons. Commander Johnson was already plotting approach routes for his stealth corvettes. The UHS Shadow and UHS Phantom were his fastest ships and could reach Altair Prime in less than 6 hours. I can have evacuation ships at the mountain caves before the Vrek's ground forces arrive, Steve announced. But once we start pulling people out, they'll know we're there. That was the heart of the tactical problem. The evacuation had to be done in secret, but moving 2 million people at a time would be impossible to hide. Once the Vreks discovered what was happening, they would throw everything they had at the human rescue ships. Dr. Margaret Lewis had been working on technical solutions, while the others planned the military aspects of the operation. Her quantum disruption torpedoes were the key to making the evacuation possible. Admiral, I recommend we use the evacuation as bait, Margaret said. Let the Vreks discover our rescue operation and then hit them with everything we have when they respond. The suggestion was bold and dangerous. Using civilian evacuation as bait went against every human military doctrine. But Admiral Morrison could see the logic in the plan. Explain your thinking, Dr. Lewis, Jake said. The Vreks fight in swarms that are difficult to target effectively, Margaret replied. But if we can draw them into attacking our evacuation fleet, we can concentrate our quantum torpedoes for maximum effect. One coordinated strike could eliminate hundreds of their ships. Captain Wright liked the tactical possibilities. Her fighters could provide a defensive screen while the main fleet launched their special weapons. If we position the fleet correctly, we can create a killing field around the evacuation site, Kelly added. Any Vreks ships that attack our rescue operation will fly straight into our torpedo range. Admiral Morrison considered all the factors and made his decision. The plan was risky, but it offered the best chance of saving the most Altarian lives. Here's what we're going to do, Jake announced. Commander Johnson will take his stealth corvettes and begin evacuating civilians from the mountain caves. Captain Wright will provide fighter cover and establish a defensive perimeter. Once the Vreks respond to our evacuation, we'll hit them with a coordinated torpedo attack. He paused to look at each of his officers. Colonel Hayes will take his Marines down to the planet's surface to secure the evacuation sites and fight any Vreks, ground forces that interfere with the rescue operation. Dr. Lewis will coordinate the torpedo attack to maximize damage to the Vreks fleet. The plan required perfect timing and a lot of luck, but it was their best option for saving as many Altarians as possible. Zeph Prime, we're going to start the evacuation. Immediately, Admiral Morrison told the alien commander. Get your people ready to move and be prepared for heavy fighting once the Vreks realize what we're doing. The first phase of the evacuation began in the dark hours before dawn on Altair Prime, when Commander Steve Johnson's stealth corvettes slipped through the Vreks patrol lines like ghosts in the night. The UHS Shadow and UHS Phantom used their advanced cloaking technology to become invisible to the biological sensors that the insect-like aliens relied upon for detection. Steve watched his tactical displays with the calm focus of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of moving unseen through hostile space. The northern mountains of Altair Prime rose from the planet's surface like jagged teeth reaching toward the star-filled sky. Hidden deep within those mountains were cave systems that had become home to nearly 1 billion Altarian refugees. These people had survived 6 months of Vreks attacks by hiding underground and moving only when absolutely necessary. Now, human ships were coming to take them to safety, but first they had to reach the surface without being detected by the thousands of Vreks scouts that patrolled the area. Colonel Danny Hayes stood in the deployment bay of his transport ship, checking the equipment of his Space Marines one final time. Each Marine wore powered armor that could withstand the harsh conditions of any world, and carried weapons designed to kill the most dangerous creatures the galaxy could produce. Their mission was to secure the evacuation sites and hold them against any Virex ground forces that tried to interfere with the rescue operation. Sergeant Linda Parker led the first squad of Marines that would go down to the planet's surface. She was a tough woman with short black hair and scars on her hands from previous battles against alien enemies. Linda had fought Vrex warriors before and knew they were fast, vicious creatures that attacked in swarms just like their ships in space. Her squad carried flamethrowers and plasma rifles because normal bullets were not always effective against Vrex biological armor. "Remember, people?" Colonel Hayes told his Marines over the communication system. "Our job is to buy time for the evacuation ships. The Altarians have been fighting for their lives for 6 months, so they're going to be scared and confused. Stay calm, keep them moving toward the ships, and don't let the Vrex get close enough to use their biological weapons. The transport ships descended through the atmosphere of Altair Prime under cover of darkness, while Captain Kelly Wright's fighter squadrons maintained a protective screen overhead. Major Chris Thompson led the lead fighter squadron from the cockpit of his advanced interceptor. Chris was one of the best pilots in the human fleet, with reflexes enhanced by years of combat training and genetic modifications that allowed him to react faster than normal humans. "All fighters maintain radio silence," Major Thompson ordered his pilots. "The Vrex haven't detected us yet, but that won't last long once we start pulling civilians off the planet." The evacuation sites had been carefully chosen for their defensibility and access to the cave systems where the Altarians were hiding. Landing pads were quickly set up using portable equipment, while Marine squads took positions on the surrounding ridges to watch for approaching enemies. The refugees began emerging from their underground shelters in small groups, moving quietly through the darkness toward the waiting human ships. Zeph Prime met Colonel Hayes at the main evacuation site, and the two military commanders quickly established a working relationship despite the differences between their species. The Altarian leader's crystalline skin reflected his emotional state, shifting from blue anxiety to green determination as he helped coordinate the movement of his people. "The children and elderly should go first," Zeph Prime told Danny through a translation device. "They cannot survive much longer in the caves and will slow down everyone else if the Vrex attack." Danny nodded agreement. Standard evacuation protocol always prioritized the most vulnerable civilians. His Marines were already helping Altarian families board the human transport ships while maintaining watch for enemy scouts. Back in space, Admiral Jake Morrison monitored the evacuation progress from the bridge of the UHS Vengeance. The main fleet hung in space several light minutes away from Altair Prime, ready to spring their trap when the Vrex inevitably discovered what was happening. Dr. Margaret Lewis had positioned her quantum disruption torpedoes for maximum effectiveness, while every ship in the fleet prepared for the largest space battle any of them had ever fought. "Admiral, we're detecting increased Vrex activity around the outer planets," Lieutenant Nathan Phillips reported from his intelligence station. "It looks like they're starting to notice our presence in the system." Jake studied the tactical displays, showing the positions of thousands of enemy bioships. The Vrex moved in patterns that seemed chaotic but actually followed a biological logic that human military planners were still learning to understand. When they discovered a threat, they would swarm toward it like antibodies attacking an infection. "How much longer do we need for the first evacuation run?" Jake asked. Commander Lisa Rodriguez checked with the surface teams. "Commander Johnson reports that his ships are nearly full. He estimates another 2 hours to complete loading and reach minimum. Safe distance from the planet. 2 hours was a long time when fighting an enemy that could cross star systems in a matter of days, but the evacuation could not be rushed without leaving people behind. On the planet's surface, the first signs of trouble appeared when Sergeant Parker's motion sensors detected movement in the forests below the mountain evacuation sites. The Vrex had finally noticed the human activity and were sending ground forces to investigate. "Colonel Hayes, we have company," Linda reported over the radio. "Multiple contacts moving up the mountain trails from the east and south. Estimate at least 500 VREX warriors heading our way." Danny quickly repositioned his Marines to create overlapping fields of fire while the evacuation continued. Behind them, Vrex ground forces were dangerous opponents that fought with biological weapons and swarm tactics that could overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers. "All squads hold your positions and wait for them to get close," Danny ordered. "Don't waste ammunition on long-range shots. Let them come to us." The Vrex warriors that emerged from the forest were nightmare creatures that moved on 6 legs with razor-sharp claws and biological weapon pods mounted on their backs. They made clicking and chittering sounds as they communicated with each other, using chemical signals that human equipment could barely detect. When they saw the Marines, they began moving faster up the mountain slopes in a coordinated assault pattern. Sergeant Parker's squad opened fire when the Vrex reached optimal range. Plasma bolts and flamethrower bursts lit up the darkness as human weapons met alien biological armor. The Vrex warriors were tough, but they had never faced enemies that fought with the determination and tactical skill of Earth's space marines. Target. "The ones with the weapon pods first," Linda shouted to her squad as she dropped a Vrex warrior with a precise shot to its central nervous cluster. "Don't let them get close enough to use their acid spitters." The battle raged across multiple mountain peaks as more Vrex forces arrived to join the attack. Colonel Hayes coordinated the defense while continuing to oversee the evacuation of Altarian civilians. Every minute his Marines held their positions meant more refugee families could board the human transport ships. In space, the Vrex fleet had finally realized that something unusual was happening around Altair Prime. Massive bioships began moving toward the planet in formations that darkened the space around them like storm clouds gathering for a hurricane. "Admiral, we have massive Vrex movement toward our position," Captain Wright reported from her carrier ship. "I count over 800 enemy vessels moving in our direction." This was exactly what Admiral Morrison had been waiting for. The Vrex were doing exactly what human battle planners had predicted they would do. They were concentrating their forces to attack what they thought was a small human rescue operation. "All ships prepare for combat," Jake ordered over the fleet communication system. "This is what we came here for. Let's show the VREX why humans are called Deathworlders." Dr. Lewis activated the quantum disruption torpedo systems on every ship in the fleet. These weapons had never been tested in large-scale combat, but computer simulations suggested they would be devastatingly effective against VREX bioships. "Torpedoes. Armed and ready, Admiral," Margaret reported. "We have 240 shots, and I recommend we make them count." The Vrex fleet approached in a massive swarm formation that would have terrified most species into immediate retreat. But the humans had fought impossible odds before, and they knew that sometimes the best defense was an aggressive offense that caught the enemy completely by surprise. Major Thompson's fighter squadrons were the first to engage the enemy when Vrex scout ships tried to get close to the evacuation site. The human pilots used hit-and-run tactics to draw the aliens away from the transport ships while avoiding the main body of the enemy fleet. "Stay mobile and keep them guessing," Chris ordered his pilots as they danced through space around the much larger Vrex bioships. We just need to buy time for the evacuation to finish. On Altair Prime, the Marines were fighting a desperate holding action against increasingly large numbers of Rex ground forces. Sergeant Parker's squad had been forced to fall back to secondary positions while more alien warriors poured out of the forests below. The quantum disruption torpedoes struck the Virex fleet like lightning from the gods of war themselves. Each weapon tore through space at near light speed before impacting the biological hulls of the alien bioships and unleashing forces that ripped apart molecular bonds at the quantum level. The effect was instantaneous and devastating as Vrex vessels simply disintegrated in brilliant flashes of energy that lit up the darkness between the stars. Admiral Jake Morrison watched from the bridge of the UHS Vengeance as over 150 enemy ships were destroyed in the first wave of torpedo impacts. The quantum weapons performed even better than Dr. Margaret Lewis had predicted, with an 85% hit rate against targets that had no defense against this type of technology. But even with such spectacular success, the human fleet still faced impossible odds as thousands of surviving Vrex bioships swarmed toward them in fury. Direct hits on 153 enemy vessels, Dr. Lewis reported with satisfaction in her voice. The quantum disruption effect is exceeding all simulation parameters. The Vrex biological hulls are particularly vulnerable to molecular breakdown. Captain Kelly Wright launched every fighter squadron from the UHS Fury as the surviving Vrex. Ships closed to combat range. Major Chris Thompson led his pilots in desperate hit and run attacks against bioships that outnumbered them by hundreds to one. The human fighters were faster and more maneuverable than their enemies, but the Vrex had the advantage of overwhelming numbers. All squadrons concentrate on their command ships, Chris ordered his pilots over the radio. Take out anything that looks like it's coordinating the swarm formations. The Vrex had been thrown into confusion by the sudden destruction of so many of their ships, but they were beginning to adapt to the human tactics. Bioships began forming defensive clusters that protected their larger command vessels while smaller. Scout ships tried to get close enough to use their biological weapons. On the planet's surface, Colonel Danny Hayes and his Space Marines were fighting a desperate battle against Vrex ground forces that seemed to multiply with every passing minute. Sergeant Linda Parker's squad had been forced back to the final defensive perimeter around the evacuation site, where thousands of Altarian civilians were still boarding human transport ships. "Colonel, we're down to our last ammunition reserves," Linda reported as she fired her plasma rifle at a charging Vrex warrior. "These things just keep coming no matter how many we kill." Danny looked at the evacuation progress and saw that Commander Steve Johnson's ships were nearly loaded with refugees. They just needed a few more minutes to complete the rescue operation, but the Vrex were pressing their attack with suicidal determination. "All Marines fix bayonets and prepare for close combat," Danny ordered. "We hold this line until every last civilian is safely aboard our ships." The Space Marines of Earth drew their combat knives and prepared to fight hand-to-hand against alien creatures that were designed by evolution to be perfect killing machines. But humans had something the Vrex could never understand, which was the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect those who could not protect themselves. In space, the battle had evolved into a massive swirling melee as human ships maneuvered through clouds of Vrex bioships while trying to avoid being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The quantum disruption torpedoes had evened the odds, but the fleet was now down to conventional weapons, and the Vrex still had significant numerical superiority. Commander Lisa Rodriguez coordinated communications between all the human ships while monitoring the progress of the evacuation. The first transport ships were beginning to lift off from Altair Prime, carrying nearly 2 million Altarian refugees to safety, But there were still billions more people who needed to be rescued. Admiral, the first evacuation run is complete, Lisa reported. Commander Johnson's ships are clear of the planet and requesting permission to head for the rally point. Jake Morrison studied the tactical situation and made a quick decision. The transport ships needed to get the refugees to safety. But the fleet could not afford to lose any fighting vessels in the middle of the largest space battle in human history. Tell Commander Johnson to get those people to safety and then return as quickly as possible, Jake ordered. We're going to need every ship we have before this is over. The Virex response to the evacuation had been swift and brutal. Their fleet, Commander Hive Queen Zaxth, had ordered every available ship to converge on the human position with instructions to destroy the invaders and recapture the escaped prisoners. The alien queen was a massive creature that commanded her forces from a bioship the size of a small moon, with weapon systems that could crack planets. Dr. Lewis monitored the approach of the Hive Queen's personal vessel with growing concern. Her sensors showed energy readings that were off the scale, and biological weapon systems unlike anything in human databases. Admiral, we have a massive contact approaching from the outer system, Margaret reported. It's easily 10 times larger than anything else the Virex have, and it's heading straight for us. The appearance of the Hive Queen changed the entire dynamic of the battle. Her massive bioship began coordinating the scattered Virex forces into more effective attack formations, while its own weapons reached out across impossible distances to strike at human vessels. Captain Wright found herself fighting a defensive battle as wave after wave of Virex fighters attacked her squadrons. Major Thompson's pilots were holding their own, but they were vastly outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Admiral, we can't keep this up much longer, Kelly reported over the communication system. My fighters are taking heavy casualties and the Virex are adapting to our tactics. General Patricia Collins had been coordinating the overall fleet movement from her position aboard the command ship. She could see that the human formation was beginning to break down under the pressure of fighting so many enemies at once. Admiral, we need to consolidate our forces, Patricia advised. If we spread out much more, the Virex will be able to defeat us in detail. Jake Morrison looked at the tactical display and saw that his fleet was indeed in danger of being split apart by the swarming Virex attack. But concentrating his ships would make them easier targets for the Hive Queen's massive weapons. On Altair Prime, the Marines were fighting their last stand as thousands of Virex warriors overran their defensive positions. Sergeant Parker had been wounded but continued to fight alongside her remaining squad members as they fell back toward the landing pads where the last transport ships were preparing to depart. Colonel Hayes, we need immediate extraction, Linda called over the radio as Virex warriors closed in from all sides. We're about to be overrun. Danny Hayes looked around at his remaining Marines and made the hardest decision of his military career. There were still civilians who needed protection, but his people had done everything humanly possible to complete the evacuation. All Marines fall back to the transport ships, Danny ordered. We've done our job here. The Space Marines fought a running battle back to their ships while the last groups of Altarian refugees scrambled aboard the human vessels. Commander Johnson's stealth corvettes provided covering fire as they prepared to lift off from the planet surface. In space, Admiral Morrison realized that the battle was reaching its climax. The Hive Queen's massive bioship was closing to weapons range, while thousands of smaller Virex vessels continued to swarm around his fleet. The quantum disruption. Torpedoes had been exhausted, and his ships were now fighting with conventional weapons against an enemy that seemed endless. All ships concentrate fire on the Hive Queen's vessel, Jake ordered. If we can take out their command ship, the rest of their fleet might break formation. Every human warship turned its weapons toward the massive alien bioship that dominated the battlefield. Particle beams and fusion missiles struck the creature's hull, causing massive explosions, but the Hive Queen seemed to absorb the damage and continue advancing. Dr. Lewis studied her sensor readings and discovered something that changed everything. The Hive Queen's bioship was not just a vessel, but a living creature that required constant biological support from the smaller ships around it. Admiral, I'm detecting biological energy transfers between the Hive Queen and her escort ships, Margaret reported excitedly. If we can cut those connections, she might not be able to maintain her weapons systems. Major Thompson heard the transmission and immediately understood what needed to be done. His fighter squadrons were low on ammunition, but they still had enough firepower to target the biological connections between the Hive Queen and her support vessels. All fighters follow my lead, Chris announced to his pilots. We're going to cut the Queen off from her drones. The human fighters dove into the swarm of Rex ships surrounding the Hive Queen and began systematically destroying the bio-connections that linked her to the rest of her fleet. It was a suicidal mission that required flying through concentrated enemy fire, but the pilots of Earth had never backed down from impossible odds. As the biological connections were severed, the Hive Queen's massive weapons began to malfunction, and her coordination of the Vrex fleet started to break down. Individual bio-ships began attacking each other in confusion as their command structure collapsed.